Audible Inc. presents Vicious, written by Victoria Schwab, narrated by Noah Michael Levine. To Miriam and Holly, for proving time and again that they are extraordinary. Life, the way it really is a battle not between bad and good, but between bad and worse. Joseph Brodsky. Part 1. Water, Blood, and Thicker Things. Chapter 1. Last night, Merritt Cemetery. Victor readjusted the shovels on his shoulder and stepped gingerly over an old half-sunken grave. His trench billowed faintly, brushing the tops of tombstones as he made his way through Merritt Cemetery, humming as he went. The sound carried like wind through the dark. It made Sydney shiver in her too-big coat and her rainbow leggings and her winter boots as she trudged along behind him. The two looked like ghosts as they wove through the graveyard, both blonde and fair enough to pass for siblings, or perhaps father and daughter. They were neither, but the resemblance certainly came in handy since Victor couldn't very well tell people he'd picked up the girl on the side of a rain-soaked road a few days before. He'd just broken out of jail. She'd just been shot. A crossing of fates, or so it seemed. In fact, Sydney was the only reason Victor was beginning to believe in fate at all. He stopped humming, rested his shoe lightly on a tombstone, and scanned the dark. Not with his eyes so much as with his skin, or rather, with the thing that crept beneath it, tangled in his pulse. He might have stopped humming, but the sensation never did, keeping on with a faint electrical buzz that only he could hear and feel and read. A buzz that told him when someone was near. Sydney watched him frown slightly. "Are we alone?" she asked. Victor blinked, and the frown was gone, replaced by the even calm he always wore. His shoe slid from the gravestone. "Just us and the dead." They made their way into the heart of the cemetery, the shovels tapping softly on Victor's shoulder as they went. Sydney kicked a loose rock that had broken off from one of the older graves. She could see that there were letters, parts of words, etched into one side. She wanted to know what they said, but the rock had already tumbled into the weeds, and Victor was still moving briskly between the graves. She ran to catch up, nearly tripping several times over the frozen ground before she reached him. He'd come to a stop and was staring down at a grave. It was fresh, the earth turned over, and a temporary marker driven into the soil until a stone one could be cut. Sydney made a noise, a small groan of discomfort that had nothing to do with the biting cold. Victor glanced back and offered her the edge of a smile. "Buck up, Sid," he said casually. "It'll be fun." Truth be told, Victor didn't care for graveyards either. He didn't like dead people, mostly because he had no effect on them. Sydney, conversely, didn't like dead people because she had such a marked effect on them. She kept her arms crossed tightly over her chest, one gloved thumb rubbing the spot on her upper arm where she'd been shot. It was becoming a tic. Victor turned and sunk one of the spades into the earth. He then tossed the other one to Sydney, who unfolded her arms just in time to catch it. The shovel was almost as tall as she was. A few days shy of her 13th birthday, and even for 12 and 11/12ths, Sydney Clark was small. She had always been on the short side, but it certainly didn't help that she had barely grown an inch since the day she'd died. Now she hefted the shovel, grimacing at the weight. "You've got to be kidding me," she said. "The faster we dig, the faster we get to go home." Home wasn't home so much as a hotel room stocked only with Sydney's stolen clothes, Mitch's chocolate milk, and Victor's files, but that wasn't the point. At this moment, home would have been any place that wasn't Merritt Cemetery. Sydney eyed the grave, tightening her fingers on the wooden grip. Victor had already begun to dig. "What if," she said, swallowing, "what if the other people accidentally wake up?" "They won't," cooed Victor. "Just focus on this grave. Besides," he looked up from his work, "since when are you afraid of bodies?" "I'm not," she snapped back, too fast and with all the force of someone used to being the younger sibling, which she was, just not Victor's. "Look at it this way," he teased, dumping a pile of dirt onto the grass. "If you do wake them up, they can't go anywhere. Now dig." Sydney leaned forward, her short blonde hair falling into her eyes, and began to dig. The two worked in the dark, only Victor's occasional humming and the thud of shovels filling the air. Thud, thud, thud. Chapter 2. 10 years ago, Lockland University. Victor drew a steady, straight black line through the word Marvel. The paper they'd printed the text on was thick enough to keep the ink from bleeding through, so long as he didn't press down too hard. He stopped to reread the altered page and winced as one of the metal flourishes on Lockland University's wrought iron fence dug into his back. The school prided itself on its country club meets Gothic manor ambiance, but the ornate railing that encircled Lockland, though striving to evoke both the university's exclusive nature and its old-world aesthetic, succeeded only in being pretentious and suffocating. It reminded Victor of an elegant cage. He shifted his weight and repositioned the book on his knee, wondering at the sheer size of it as he twirled the Sharpie over his knuckles. It was a self-help book, the latest in a series of 5 by the world-renowned Doctors Vale. The very same Vales who were currently on an international tour, the very same Vales who had budgeted just enough time in their busy schedules, even back before they were best-selling empowerment gurus, to produce Victor. He thumbed back through the pages until he found the beginning of his most recent undertaking and began to read. For the first time, he wasn't effacing a Vale book simply for pleasure. No, this was for credit. Victor couldn't help but smile. He took an immense pride in paring down his parents' work, stripping the expansive chapters on empowerment down to simple, disturbingly effective messages. He'd been blacking them out for more than a decade now, since he was 10, a painstaking but satisfying affair. But until last week, he'd never been able to count it for anything as useful as school credit. Last week, when he'd accidentally left his latest project in the art studios over lunch. Lockland University had a mandatory art credit, even for budding doctors and scientists, and come back to his teacher, poring over it. He'd expected a reprimand, some lecture on the cultural cost of defacing literature, or maybe the material cost of paper. Instead, the teacher had taken the literacy destruction as art. He'd practically supplied the explanation, filled in any blanks using terms such as expression, identity, found art, reshaping. Victor had only nodded and offered a perfect word to the end of the teacher's list. Rewriting. And just like that, his senior art thesis had been determined. The marker hissed as he drew another line, blotting out several sentences in the middle of the page. His knee was going numb from the weight of the tome. If he were in need of self-help, he would search for a thin, simple book, one whose shape mimicked its promise. But maybe some people needed more. Maybe some people scanned the shelves for the heftiest one, assuming that more pages meant more emotional or psychological aid. He skimmed the words and smiled as he found another section to ink out. By the time the first bell rang, signaling the end of Victor's art elective, he'd turned his parents' lectures on how to start the day into be lost, give up, give in. In the end, it would be better to surrender before you begin. Be lost, and then you will not care if you are ever found. He'd had to strike through entire paragraphs to make the sentence perfect after he accidentally marked out ever, and had to go on until he found another instance of the word. But it was worth it. The pages of black that stretched between if you are and ever and found gave the words just the right sense of abandonment. Victor heard someone coming but didn't look up. He flipped through to the back of the book where he'd been working on a separate exercise. The Sharpie cut through another paragraph, line by line, the sound as slow and even as breathing. He'd marveled once that his parents' books were, in fact, self-help, simply not in the way they'd intended. He found their destruction incredibly soothing, a kind of meditation. Vandalizing school property again? Victor looked up to find Eli standing over him. The library plastic cover crinkled beneath his fingertips as he tipped the book up to show Eli the spine, where Vale was printed in bold capital letters. He wasn't about to pay $25.99 when Lockland's library had a suspiciously extensive collection of Vale doctrine self-help. Eli took the book from him and skimmed. Perhaps it is in our best interest to surrender, to give up, rather than waste. Words. Victor shrugged. He wasn't done yet. "You have an extra 2 before surrender," said Eli, tossing the book back. Victor caught it and frowned, tracing his finger through the makeshift sentence until he found his mistake, and efficiently blotting out the word. "You've got too much time, Vic." "You must make time for that which matters," he recited, "for that which defines you, your passion, your progress, your pen. Take it up and write your own story." Eli looked at him for a long moment, brow crinkling. "That's awful." "It's from the introduction," said Victor. "Don't worry, I blacked it out." He flipped back through the pages, a web of thin letters and fat black lines until he reached the front. "They totally murdered Emerson." Eli shrugged. "All I know is that book's a sniffer's dream," he said. He was right. The 4 Sharpies Victor had gone through in converting the book to art had given it an incredibly strong odor, one which Victor found at once entrancing and revolting. He got enough of a high from the destruction itself, but he supposed the smell was an unexpected addition to the project's complexity, or so the art teacher would spin it. Eli leaned back against the rail. His rich brown hair caught the too bright sun, bringing out reds and even threads of gold. Victor's hair was a pale blonde. When the sunlight hit him, it didn't bring out any colors, but only accentuated the lack of color, making him look more like an old-fashioned photo than a flesh-and-blood student. Eli was still staring down at the book in Victor's hands. "Doesn't the Sharpie ruin whatever's on the other side?" "You'd think," said Victor, "but they use this freakishly heavy paper, like they want the weight of what they're saying to sink in." Eli's laugh was drowned by the second bell, ringing out across the emptying quad. The bells weren't buzzers, of course. Lockland was too civilized, but they were loud and almost ominous, a single deep church bell from the spiritual center that sat in the middle of campus. Eli cursed and helped Victor to his feet, already turning toward the huddle of science buildings, faced in rich red brick to make them seem less sterile. Victor took his time. They still had a minute before the final bell sounded, and even if they were late, the teachers would never mark them down. All Eli had to do was smile. All Victor had to do was lie. Both proved frighteningly effective. Victor sat in the back of his comprehensive science seminar, a course designed to reintegrate students of various scientific disciplines for their senior theses, learning about research methods, or at least being told about research methods. Distressed by the fact that the class relied on laptops, and since striking through words on a screen hardly gave him the same satisfaction, Victor had taken to watching the other students sleep, doodle, stress out, listen, and pass digital notes. Unsurprisingly, they failed to hold his interest for long, and soon his gaze drifted past them, and past the windows, and past the lawn, past everything. His attention was finally dragged back to the lecture when Eli's hand went up. Victor hadn't caught the question, but he watched his roommate smile his perfect, all-American political candidate smile before he answered. Eliot, Eli, Cardale had started out as a predicament. Victor had been none too happy to find the lanky, brown-haired boy standing in the doorway of his dorm a month into sophomore year. His first roommate had experienced a change of heart in the first week, through no fault of Victor's, of course, and had promptly dropped out. Due either to a shortage of students or perhaps a filing error made possible by fellow sophomore Max Hall's penchant for any Lockland-specific hacking challenge, the student hadn't been replaced. Victor's painfully small double was converted into a much more adequate single room, until the start of October, when Eliot Cardale, who, Victor had immediately decided, smiled too much, appeared with a suitcase in the hall outside. Victor had initially wondered what it would take to recover his bedroom for a second time in a semester, but before he put any plans into motion, an odd thing happened. Eli began to grow on him. He was precocious and frighteningly charming, the kind of guy who got away with everything, thanks to good genes and quick wits. He was born for the sports teams and the clubs, but he surprised everyone, especially Victor, by showing no inclination whatsoever to join either. This small defiance of social norm earned him several notches in Victor's estimation and made him instantly more interesting. But what fascinated Victor most was the fact that something about Eli was decidedly wrong. He was like one of those pictures full of small errors, the kind you could only pick out by searching the image from every angle, and even then, a few always slipped by. On the surface, Eli seemed perfectly normal, but now and then Victor would catch a crack, a sideways glance. A moment when his roommate's face and his words, his look and his meaning, would not line up. Those fleeting slices fascinated Victor. It was like watching two people, one hiding in the other's skin, and their skin was always too dry, on the verge of cracking and showing the color of the thing beneath. "Very astute, Mr. Cardale." Victor had missed the question and the answer. He looked up as Professor Line turned his attention to the rest of his seniors and clapped his hands once with finality. "All right, time to declare your thesis." The class, composed mostly of pre-med students, a handful of aspiring physicists, and even an engineer, not Angie, though, she'd been assigned a different section, gave a collective groan on principle. Now, said the professor, cutting off the protest. "You knew what you were getting into when you signed up." "We didn't," observed Max. "It's a mandatory course." The remark earned him a ripple of encouragement from the class. "My sincerest apologies, then, but now that you're here, and seeing that there's no time like the present—" "Next week will be better," called out Toby Powell, a broad-shouldered surfer, pre-med, and the son of some governor. Max had only earned a murmur, but this time the other students laughed at a level proportionate to Toby's popularity. "Enough," said Professor Line. The class quieted. "Now, Lockland encourages a certain level of industriousness where these theses are concerned, and offers a proportionate amount of freedom. But a word of warning from me. I've taught this thesis seminar for 7 years. You will do yourselves no favors by making a safe selection and flying under the radar. However, an ambitious thesis will win no points on the grounds of ambitiousness alone. Your grade is contingent upon execution. Find a topic close enough to your area of interest to be productive, without selecting one you already consider yourselves expert on." He offered Toby a withering smile. "Start us off, Mr. Powell." Toby ran his fingers through his hair, stalling. The professor's disclaimer had clearly shaken his confidence in whatever topic he'd been about to declare. He made a few non-committal sounds while scrolling through his papers. T helper 17 cells and immunology." He was careful not to let his voice wander up at the end into a question. Professor Line let him hang for a moment, and everyone waited to see if he would give Toby the look, the slight lift of his chin and the tilt of his head that he had become famous for. A look that said, "Perhaps you'd like to try again." But finally, he honored him with a small nod. His gaze pivoted. "Mr. Hall." Max opened his mouth when Line cut in with, "No tech. Science, yes. Tech, no. So choose wisely." Max's mouth snapped shut a moment as he considered. "Electrical efficacy in sustainable energy," he said after a pause. "Hardware over software. Admirable choice, Mr. Hall." Professor Line continued around the room. Inheritance patterns, equilibriums, and radiation were all approved, while effects of alcohol, cigarettes, illegal substances, the chemical properties of methamphetamines, and the body's response to sex all earned the look. One by one, the topics were accepted or retooled. "Next," ordered Professor Line, his sense of humor ebbing. "Chemical pyrotechnics." A long pause. The topic had come from Janine Ellis, whose eyebrows hadn't fully recovered from her last round of research. Professor Line gave a sigh, accompanied by the look, but Janine only smiled, and there wasn't much Line could say. Ellis was one of the youngest students in the room, and had, in her freshman year, discovered a new and vibrant shade of blue that firework companies across the world now used. If she was willing to risk her eyebrows, that was her own business. "And you, Mr. Vale." Victor looked at his professor, narrowing down his options. He'd never been strong in physics, and while chemistry was fun, his real passion lay in biology, anatomy, and neuroscience. He'd like a topic with the potential for experimentation, but he'd also like to keep his eyebrows. And while he wanted to hold his rank in the department, offers from med schools, graduate programs, and research labs had been coming in the mail for weeks, and under the table for months. He and Eli had been decorating their entry hall with the letters. Not the offers, no, but the letters that preceded them, all praise and charm, batting lashes and handwritten postscripts. Neither one of them needed to move worlds with their papers. Victor glanced over at Eli, wondering what he would choose. Professor Line cleared his throat. "Adrenal inducers," said Victor on a lark. "Mr. Vale, I've already turned down a proposal involving intercourse—" "No," Victor said, shaking his head. "Adrenaline and its physical and emotional inducers and consequences. Biochemical thresholds, fight or flight, that kind of thing." He watched Professor Line's face, waiting for a sign, and Line eventually nodded. "Don't make me regret it," he said. And then he turned to Eli, the last person to answer. "Mr. Cardale." Eli smiled calmly. "EOs." The whole class, which had devolved more and more into muffled conversation as students declared their topics, now stopped. The background chatter and the sound of typing and the fidgeting in chairs went still, as Professor Line considered Eli with a new look, one that hung between surprise and confusion, tempered only by the understanding that Elliot Cardale was consistently top of the class, top of the entire pre-medical department, even, well, alternating with Victor for first and second spot, anyway. 15 pairs of eyes flicked between Eli and Professor Line as the moment of silence lasted and became uncomfortable. Eli wasn't the kind of student to propose something as a joke or a test, but he couldn't possibly be serious. "I'm afraid you'll have to expand," said Line slowly. Eli's smile didn't falter. "An argument for the theoretical feasibility of the existence of extraordinary people, deriving from laws of biology, chemistry, and psychology." Professor Line's head tilted and his chin tipped, but when he opened his mouth, all he said was, "Be careful, Mr. Cardale. As I warned, no points will be given for ambition alone. I trust you not to make a mockery of my class." "Is that a yes, then?" asked Eli. The first bell rang. One person's chair scraped back an inch, but no one stood up. "Fine," said Professor Line. Eli's smile widened. Fine, thought Victor, and reading the looks of every other student in the room, he could see everything from curiosity to surprise to envy echoed in their faces. It was a joke. It had to be. But Professor Line only straightened and resumed his usual composure. "Go forth, students," he said. "Create change." The room erupted into movement. Chairs were dragged, tables knocked askew, bags hoisted, and the class emptied in a wave into the hall, taking Victor with it. He looked around the corridor for Eli and saw that he was still in the room, talking quietly, animatedly with Professor Line. For a moment the steady calm was gone, and his eyes were bright with energy, glinting with hunger. But by the time he broke away and joined Victor in the hall, it was gone, hidden behind a casual smile. "What the hell was that?" Victor demanded. "I know the thesis doesn't much matter at this point, but still, was that some kind of joke?" Eli shrugged, and before the matter could be pressed, his phone broke out into electro-rock in his pocket. Victor sagged against the wall as Eli dug it out. "Hey, Angie. Yeah, we're on our way." He hung up without even waiting for a response. "We've been summoned." Eli slung his arm around Victor's shoulders. "My fair damsel is hungry. I dare not keep her waiting." Chapter 3. Last night, Merritt Cemetery. Sydney's arms were beginning to ache from lifting the shovel, but for the first time in a year she wasn't cold. Her cheeks burned, and she was sweating through her coat, and she felt alive. As far as she was concerned, that was the only good thing about digging up a corpse. "Couldn't we do something else?" she asked, leaning on the shovel. She knew Victor's answer, could feel his patience thinning, but she still had to ask because asking was talking, and talking was the only thing distracting her from the fact that she was standing over a body and digging her way toward it instead of away from it. "The message has to be sent," said Victor. He didn't stop digging. "Well, then maybe we could send a different message," she said under her breath. "It has to be done, Sid," he said, finally looking up. "So try to think of something pleasant." She sighed and started digging again. A few scoops of dirt later, she stopped. She was almost afraid to ask. "What are you thinking of, Victor?" He flashed a small, dangerous smile. "I'm thinking about what a lovely night it is." They both knew it was a lie, but Sydney decided she'd rather not know the truth. Victor wasn't thinking of the weather. He hardly felt the cold through his coat. He was too busy trying to picture what Eli's face would look like when he received their message. Trying to picture the shock, the anger, and threaded through it all, the fear. Fear because it could mean only one thing. Victor was out. Victor was free. And Victor was coming for Eli, just as he'd promised he would. He sunk the shovel into the cold earth with a satisfying thud. Chapter 4. 10 years ago, Lockland University. "You're seriously not going to tell me what that was about?" asked Victor as he followed Eli through the massive double doors and into the Lockland International Dining Suite, more commonly known as Lids. Eli didn't answer as he scanned the eating hall for Angie. The whole place resembled a theme park, in Victor's opinion, all the mundane trappings of a cafeteria, hidden beneath plastic and plaster facades that were out of scale and out of place beside each other. Circling a quad-sized stretch of tables, 11 eatery options each boasted different menus in different fonts, with different decor. By the doors was a bistro, complete with a low little gate erected for a waiting line. Next to it, Italian music played, several pizza ovens gaping behind the counter. Across the way, the Thai, Chinese, and sushi places sat in paper lantern colors, bright and primary and inviting. Joining these were a burger joint, a carving station, a comfort food kitchen, a salad bar, a smoothie shop, and a basic cafe. Angie Knight was sitting near the Italian eatery, twirling pasta on her fork, her coppery curls wandering into her eyes as she read a book pinned beneath her tray. A small prickle ran through Victor when he spotted her. The voyeuristic thrill of seeing someone before they see you, of being able to simply watch. But the moment ended when Eli saw her too, and caught her gaze without a word. They were like magnets, thought Victor, each with their own pull. They showed it every day in class and around campus, people always drifting toward them. Even Victor felt the draw. And then, when they got close enough to each other, well. Angie's arms were around Eli's neck in an instant, her perfect lips against his. Victor looked away, giving them a moment of privacy, which was absurd considering their public display of affection was very public. A female professor looked up from a folded paper several tables over, one eyebrow quirking before she turned the page with a loud crack. Eventually, Eli and Angie managed to pry themselves apart, and she acknowledged Victor with a hug, a gesture that was simple but genuine, all the warmth but none of the heat. And that was okay. He was not in love with Angie Knight. She didn't belong to him. Even though he met her first, even though he'd been a magnet for her once, and she'd wandered toward him in Lids that first week of school freshman year, and they'd had smoothies because it was still ungodly hot out even in September, and her face was red from track, and his was red from her. Even though she hadn't even met Eli until sophomore year when Victor brought his new roommate to sit with him at dinner, because it seemed like good karma. Fucking karma, he thought, as Angie pulled away and floated back to her seat. Eli grabbed soup, and Victor bought Chinese, and the three sat in the growing noise of the eating hall and ate and made mindless conversation, even though Victor desperately wanted to find out what the hell Eli was thinking picking EOs as a thesis. But Victor knew better than to interrogate him in front of Angie. Angie Knight was a force with long legs, and the most severe case of curiosity that Victor had ever encountered. She was only 20, had been coveted by the top school since she could drive, had been given a dozen business cards followed by a dozen offers and just as many follow-ups, both subtle and not-so-subtle bribes. And here she was at Lockland. She'd recently accepted an offer from an engineering firm, and upon graduation would be the youngest, and, Victor wagered, the brightest employee of their company. She wouldn't even be able to drink yet. Besides, judging by the looks the other students had given Eli when he made his thesis selection, word would reach her soon enough. Finally, after a lunch dotted with pauses and occasional warning glances from Eli, the bell rang and Angie left for her next class. She wasn't even supposed to have a next class, but she'd taken on an extra elective. Eli and Victor sat and watched her cloud of red hair bob away with all the glee of someone off to eat cake, not explore forensic chemistry or mechanical efficacy or whatever she'd picked up as a pet project this time. Or rather, Eli watched her go, and Victor watched Eli watch her. Something twisted in his stomach. It wasn't just that Eli stole Angie from Victor, that was bad enough. But somehow, Angie had stolen Eli from him, too. The more interesting Eli, anyway. Not the one with perfect teeth and an easy laugh, but the one beneath that was glittering and sharp like broken glass. It was in those jagged pieces that Victor saw something he recognized. Something dangerous and hungry. But when Eli was with Angie, it never showed. He was a model boyfriend, caring, attentive, and dull. And Victor found himself studying his friend in Angie's wake, searching for signs of life. Several quiet minutes passed as the eating halls thinned and emptied, and then Victor lost patience and kicked Eli under the wood table. His eyes drifted lazily up from his food. "Yes?" "Why EOs?" Eli's face slowly began to open, and Victor felt his chest loosen with relief as Eli's darker self peeked through. "Do you believe in them?" asked Eli, drawing patterns in what was left of his soup. Victor hesitated, chewing on a piece of lemon chicken. EO. Extraordinary. He had heard of them, the way people hear about any phenomena, from believer sites and the occasional late-night exposé where experts analyze grainy footage of a man lifting a car or a woman engulfed in fire without burning. Hearing about EOs and believing in EOs were very different things, and he couldn't tell by Eli's tone which camp he fell into. He couldn't tell which camp Eli wanted him to fall into either, which made answering infinitely harder. "Well?" prompted Eli. "Do you believe?" "I don't know," Victor said truthfully. "If it's a matter of believing—" "Everything starts with belief," countered Eli. "With faith." Victor cringed. It was a kink in his understanding of Eli, the latter's reliance on religion. Victor did his best to overlook it, but it was a constant snag in their dialogues. Eli must have sensed he was losing him. "With wonder, then," he amended. "Do you ever wonder?" Victor wondered about lots of things. He wondered about himself, whether he was broken or special or better or worse. And about other people, whether they were all really as stupid as they seemed. He wondered about Angie. What would happen if he told her how he felt? What it would be like if she chose him. He wondered about life and people and science and magic and God, and whether he believed in any of them. "I do," he said slowly. "Well, when you wonder something," said Eli, "doesn't that mean part of you wants to believe in it? I think we want to prove things in life, more than we want to disprove them. We want to believe." "And you want to believe in superheroes?" Victor's voice was carefully devoid of judgment, but he couldn't smother the smile that crept across his mouth. He hoped Eli wouldn't take offense, would only see it as good humor, levity, not mockery. But he didn't. His face snapped shut. "Fine, yeah, it's stupid, right? You caught me. I didn't give a shit about the thesis. I just wanted to see if Lime would let me get away with it," he said, flashing a rather hollow smile and pushing up from the table. "That's all." "Wait," said Victor. "It's not all." "That's all." Eli turned, dumped his tray, and walked out before Victor could say more. Victor always kept a Sharpie in his back pocket. As he wandered the aisles of the library searching for books to kick-start his own thesis, his fingers itched to take it out. His failed conversation with Eli had set him on edge, and he longed to find his quiet, his peace, his personal zen in the slow obliteration of someone else's words. He managed to make his way to the medical section without incident, adding a book on the human nervous system to the one he'd already picked up on psychology. After finding a few smaller texts on adrenal glands and human impulse, he checked out, careful to keep his fingertips, permanently stained from his art projects, hidden in his pockets or under the lip of the counter while the librarian looked over the books. There had been a few complaints during his time at Lockland about books being vandalized, if not outright ruined. The librarian looked at him over the stack, as if his crimes were written on his face instead of his fingers, before finally scanning in the books and handing them back. Back in the university-issued apartment he shared with Eli, Victor unpacked his bag. He knelt in his bedroom and slid the marked-up self-help book onto a low shelf beside two others he'd checked out and altered, silently pleased that no return calls had been placed on any of them yet. The books on adrenaline he left on his desk. He heard the front door open and shut, and wandered into the living room a few minutes later to find Eli flopping down onto the couch. He'd set a stack of books and stapled printouts on the university-issued wooden coffee table, but when he saw Victor come in, he reached instead for a magazine and began to flip through it, feigning boredom. The books on the table were on everything from brain function under stress to human will, anatomy, psychosomatic responses, but the printouts were different. Victor picked up one of them and sank into a chair to read it. Eli frowned faintly as he did it, but didn't stop him. The printouts were captures from websites, message boards, forums. They would never be seen as admissible sources. "Tell me the truth," said Victor, tossing the pages back onto the table between them. "About what?" asked Eli absently. Victor stared, blue eyes unblinking, until Eli finally set the magazines aside, sat up, and pivoted, setting his feet firmly on the ground so he could mirror Victor's position. "Because I think they might be real," he said. "Might," he emphasized. "But I'm willing to consider the possibility." Victor was surprised at the sincerity in his friend's voice. "Go on," he said, offering his best trust-me face. Eli ran his fingers over the stack of books. "Try to look at it like this. In comic books, there are two ways a hero is made, nature and nurture. You have Superman, who was born the way he was, and Spider-Man, who was made that way. You with me?" "I am." "If you do even a basic web search for EOs," here he gestured at the printouts, "you find the same divide. Some people claiming that EOs are born extraordinary, and others suggesting everything from radioactive goo and poisonous insects to random chance. Let's say you manage to find an EO, so you've got the proof they do exist. The question becomes how. Are they born, or are they made?" Victor watched the way that Eli's eyes took on a sheen when he spoke of EOs, and the change in his tone, lower, more urgent, matched with the nervously shifting muscles in his face as he tried to hide his excitement. The zeal peeked through at the corners of his mouth, the fascination around his eyes, the energy in his jaw. Victor watched his friend, mesmerized by the transformation. He himself could mimic most emotions and pass them off as his, but mimicking only went so far, and he knew he could never match this fervor. He didn't even try. Instead, he kept calm, listened, his eyes attentive and reverent so that Eli wouldn't be discouraged, wouldn't retreat. The last thing Victor wanted to do was retreat. It had taken nearly 2 years of friendship to crack through the charming, candy shell and find the thing Victor had always known lurked within. And now, slouching around a coffee table stacked with low-res screenshots of sites run by grown men in their parents' basements, it was as if Elliot Cardale had found God. Even better, as if he had found God and wanted to keep it a secret but couldn't. It shone through his skin like light. "So," said Victor slowly, "let's assume EOs do exist. You're going to figure out how." Eli flashed him the kind of smile a cult leader would covet. "That's the idea." Chapter 5. Last night, Merritt Cemetery. Thud. Thud, thud. "How long were you in prison?" asked Sydney, trying to fill the quiet. The sound of digging, when combined with Victor's absent humming, wasn't helping her nerves. "Too long," answered Victor. Thud, thud. Her fingers hurt dully from gripping the shovel. "And that's where you met Mitch?" Mitchell Turner, was the massive man waiting for them back in the hotel room. Not because he didn't like graveyards, he told them emphatically. No, it was just that someone had to stay behind with Doll, and besides, there was work to do. Lots of work. It had nothing to do with the bodies. Sydney smiled when she thought of him scrounging for excuses. It made her feel a fraction better to think of Mitch, who was roughly the size of a car and could probably lift one with ease, being squeamish about death. "We were cellmates," he said. "There are lots of very bad people in jail, Sid, and only a few decent ones. Mitch was one of them." Thud. Thud. "Are you one of the bad ones?" asked Sydney. Her watery blue eyes stared straight at him, unblinking. She wasn't sure if the answer mattered, really, but she felt like she should know. "Some would say so," he said. Thud. She kept staring at him. "I don't think you're a bad person, Victor." Victor kept digging. "It's all a matter of perspective." Thud. "About the prison, did they let you out?" she asked quietly. Thud. Victor left the shovel planted in the ground and looked up at her, and then he smiled, which she noticed he seemed to do a lot before he lied, and said, "Of course." Chapter 6. A week ago, Wrighton Penitentiary. Prison was less important than what it afforded Victor, namely, time. 5 years in isolation gave him time to think. 4 years in integration, thanks to budget cuts and the lack of evidence that Vale was in any way abnormal, gave him time to practice, and 463 inmates to practice on. And the last 7 months had given him time to plan this moment. "Did you know?" said Victor, skimming a book from the prison library on anatomy. He thought it particularly foolish to endow inmates with a detailed sense of the positions of vital organs, but there you go. "That when you take away a person's fear of pain, you take away their fear of death? You make them, in their own eyes, immortal. Which, of course, they're not, but what's the saying? We are all immortal until proven otherwise?" "Something like that," said Mitch, who was a bit preoccupied. Mitch was Victor's cellmate at Wrighton Federal Penitentiary. Victor was fond of Mitch, in part because Mitch was thoroughly unconcerned with prison politics, and in part because he was clever. People didn't seem to catch on because of the man's size, but Victor saw the talent and put it to good use. For instance, Mitch was presently trying to short out a security camera with a gum wrapper, a cigarette, and a small piece of wire Victor had secured for him 3 days before. "Got it," said Mitch a few moments later, when Victor was thumbing through the chapter on the nervous system. He set the book aside and flexed his fingers as the guard came down the aisle. "Shall we?" he asked as the air began to hum. Mitch took a long look around their cell and nodded. "After you." Chapter 7. 2 days ago, on the road. The rain hit the car in waves. There was so much of it that the wiper blades did nothing to clear it away, only managed to move it around on the windows. But neither Mitch nor Victor complained. After all, the car was stolen, and obviously stolen well. They'd been driving it without incident for almost a week, ever since they swiped it from the rest stop a few miles from the prison. The car passed a sign that pronounced Merit, 23 miles. Mitch drove and Victor stared out past the downpour at the world as it flew by. It felt so fast. Everything felt fast after being in a cell for 10 years. Everything felt free. For the first few days they had driven aimlessly, the need to move outweighing the need for a destination. Victor hadn't known where they were driving. He hadn't decided yet where to start the search. 10 years was long enough to plan the details of the prison break down to the minutiae. Within an hour he had new clothes. Within a day he had money. But a week out, and he still didn't have a place to start looking for Eli. Until that morning. He'd picked up the National Mark, a nationwide paper, from a gas station, flipping absently through, and fate had smiled at him. Or at least, someone had smiled. Smiled straight up from a photo printed to the right of a news article titled, "Civilian Hero Saves Bank." The bank was located in Merritt, a sprawling metropolis halfway between Wrighton's barbed wire walls and Lockland's wrought iron fences. He and Mitch had been heading there for no other reason than the fact that it was somewhere to go. A city full of people Victor could question, persuade, coerce. And a city that was already showing promise, he thought, lifting the folded paper. He had bought the copy of the National Mark, but taken only that page, slipping it into his folder almost reverently. It was a start. Now, Victor closed his eyes and tipped his head back against the seat while Mitch drove. "Where are you, Eli?" he wondered. "Where are you? Where are you? Where are you? Where are you?" The question echoed in his head. He wondered it every day for a decade, some days absently and others with such an intense need to know that it hurt. It actually hurt. And for Victor, that was something. His body settled back into the seat as the world sped by. They hadn't taken the freeway. Most escaped convicts knew better than that, but the speed limit on the 2-lane highway was more than satisfactory. Anything was better than standing still, he thought, as his eyes unfocused. Sometime later, the car hit a small pothole, and the bump jarred Victor from his reverie. He blinked and turned his head to watch the trees that bordered the road zip past. He rolled down the window halfway to feel that speed, ignoring Mitch's protests about the rain splashing into the car. He didn't care about the water or the seats. He needed to feel it. It was dusk, and in the last dregs of the day Victor caught sight of a shape moving down the side of the road. It was small, head-bowed, and clutching at itself as it trudged down the narrow shoulder of the highway. Victor's car passed it before he frowned and spoke up. "Mitch, go back." "For what?" Victor turned his attention to the massive man behind the wheel. "Don't make me ask again." Mitch didn't. He threw the car into reverse, the tires slipping on the wet pavement. They passed the figure again, but this time going backward. Mitch shifted the car again into drive and crawled up alongside the shape. Victor rolled down his window the rest of the way, the rain pressing in. "You all right?" he asked over the rain. The figure didn't respond. Victor felt something prickle at the edge of his senses, humming. Pain. It wasn't his. "Stop the car," he said, and this time Mitch put the vehicle promptly, a little too promptly, into park. Victor got out, zipped his coat up to his throat, and began to walk alongside the stranger. He was a good 2 heads taller. "You're hurt," he said to the bundle of wet clothes. It wasn't the arms crossed tightly over the form's chest that gave it away, or the dark stain on one sleeve, darker even than the rain, or the way the figure pulled back sharply when he reached out a hand. Victor smelled pain the way a wolf smelled blood, tuned to it. "Stop," he said, and this time the person's steps dragged to a halt. The rain fell, steady and cold, around them. "Get in the car." The figure looked up at him then, and the wet hood of the coat fell back onto a pair of narrow shoulders. Water-blue eyes, fierce behind smudged black liner, stared up at him from a young face. Victor knew pain too well to be fooled by the defiant look, the set jaw around which wet blonde hair curled and stuck. She couldn't be more than 12, 13 maybe. "Come on," he pressed, gesturing to the car that had stopped beside them. The girl just stared at him. "What's going to happen to you?" he asked. "Couldn't be worse than what already has." When she made no motion toward the car, he sighed and pointed at her arm. "Let me look at that." He reached out, letting his fingers graze her jacket. The air around his hand crackled the way it always did, and the girl let out a barely audible breath of relief. She rubbed at her sleeve. "Hey, stop that," he warned, knocking her hand away from the wound. "I didn't fix it." Her eyes danced between his hand and her sleeve and back again. "I'm cold," she said. "I'm Victor," he said, and she offered him a small, exhausted flicker of a smile. "Now what do you say we get out of the rain?" Chapter 8. Last night, Merritt Cemetery. "You're not a bad person," repeated Sidney, flinging dirt onto the moonlit grass. "But Eli is." "Yes, Eli is." "But he didn't go to prison?" "No." "Do you think he'll get the message?" she asked, pointing at the grave. "I'm pretty sure," said Victor, "and if he doesn't, your sister will." Sidney's stomach twisted at the thought of Serena. In her mind, her big sister was 2 different people, 2 images overlapping in a way that blurred both, and made her feel dizzy, ill. There was the Serena from before the lake, the Serena who'd knelt on the floor in front of her the day she left for college. They both knew she was abandoning Sidney to the toxic, empty house, and who used her thumb to wipe tears from Sidney's cheek, saying over and over, "I'm not gone. I'm not gone." And then there was the Serena from after the lake, the Serena whose eyes were cold, and whose smile was hollow, and who made things happen with only words, the one who lured Sidney into a field with a body, cooing at her to show her trick, and then looking sad when she did, the one who turned her back when her boyfriend raised his gun. "I don't want to see Serena," said Sidney. "I know," said Victor, But I want to see Eli."
"Why?" she asked. "You can't kill him."
"That may be." His fingers curled around the shovel. "But half the fun is trying." Chapter 9. 10 years ago, Lockland University. When Eli picked up Victor from the airport a few days before the start of spring semester, he was wearing the kind of smile that made Victor nervous. Eli had as many different smiles as ice cream shops had flavors, and this one said he had a secret. Victor didn't want to care, but he did, and since he couldn't seem to keep himself from caring, he was determined to at least keep himself from showing it. Eli had spent the whole break on campus doing research for his thesis. Angie had complained because he was supposed to go away with her. Angie, as Victor predicted, was not a fan of Eli's thesis, neither the subject matter nor the percent of his time it was occupying. Eli claimed the holiday research stint was a token to placate Professor Line, to prove he was taking the thesis seriously. But Victor didn't like it because it meant that Eli had a head start. Victor didn't like it because he had, of course, petitioned to stay over break too, applied for the same exemptions, and had been denied. It had taken all his control to hide the anger, the desire to pen over Eli's life and rewrite it into his. Somehow he managed only a shrug and a smile, and Eli promised to keep him in the loop if he made any headway in their. Eli had said their, not his, and that had helped placate him. Area of interest. Victor had heard nothing all during break. Then a few days before he was scheduled to fly back to campus, Eli called to say he'd found something, but refused to tell his friend what it was until the two were back on campus. Victor had wanted to book an earlier flight. He couldn't wait to escape the company of his parents, who had first insisted on a Christmas together, and then on reminding him daily of the sacrifice they were making, since holidays were their most popular tour slots. But he didn't want to seem too eager, so he waited out the days, working furiously on his own adrenal research, which felt remedial by comparison, a simple issue of cause and effect, with too much documented data to make for much of a challenge. It was regurgitation. Competently organized and elegantly worded, yes, but dotted by hypotheses that felt, to Victor, uninspired, dull. Line had called the outline solid, had said that Victor was off to a running start, but Victor didn't want to run, while Eli was busy trying to fly. And so, by the time he climbed into the passenger seat of Eli's car, his fingers were rapping on his knees from excitement. He stretched in an effort to still them, but as soon as they hit his legs again, they resumed their restless motion. He'd spent most of the flight storing up indifference so that when Eli saw, the first words out of his mouth wouldn't be, "Tell me." But now that they were together, his composure was failing. "Well?" he asked, trying unsuccessfully to sound bored. "What did you find?" Eli tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he drove toward Lockland. "Trauma." "What about it?" "It was the only commonality I could find in all the cases of EOs that are even close to well documented. Anyway, bodies react in strange ways under stress. Adrenaline and all that, as you know. I figured that trauma could cause the body to chemically alter." He began to speak faster. "But the problem is, trauma is such a vague word, right? It's a whole blanket, really, and I needed to isolate a thread. Millions of people are traumatized daily, emotionally, physically, what have you. If even a fraction of them became extraordinary, they would compose a measurable percentage of the human population. And if that were the case, EOs would be more than a thing in quotation marks, more than a hypothesis. They'd be an actuality. I knew there had to be something more specific." "A genre of trauma? Like car accidents?" asked Victor. "Yes, exactly. Except there weren't indicators of any common trauma, no obvious formula, no parameters. Not at first." Eli let his words hang in the car. Victor turned the radio from low to off. Eli was practically bouncing in his seat. "But," prompted Victor, cringing at his own obvious interest. "But I started digging," said Eli. "And a few case studies I could dig up, unofficial ones, of course, and this shit was a pain to find. The people in them weren't just traumatized, Vic. They died. I didn't see it at first because 9 times out of 10 when a person doesn't stay dead, it isn't even recorded as an NDE. Hell, half the time people don't realize they've had an NDE. NDE? Eli glanced over at Victor. Near-death experience. What if an EO isn't a product of just any trauma? What if their bodies are reacting to the greatest physical and psychological trauma possible? Death. Think about it. The kind of transformation we're talking about wouldn't be possible with a physiological reaction alone or a psychological reaction alone. It would require a huge influx of adrenaline, of fear, awareness. We talk about the power of will. We talk about mind over matter. But it's not one over the other. It's both at once. The mind and the body both respond to imminent death. And in those cases where both are strong enough, and both would have to be strong, I'm talking about genetic predisposition and will to survive, I think you might have a recipe for an EO. Victor's mind whirred as he listened to Eli's theory. He flexed his fingers against his pant legs. It made sense. It made sense, and it was simple and elegant, and Victor hated that. Especially because he should have seen it first, should have been able to hypothesize. Adrenaline was his research topic. The only difference was that he'd been studying temporary flux, and Eli had gone so far as to suggest a permanent shift. Anger flared through him, but anger was unproductive, so he twisted it into pragmatism while he searched for a flaw. "Say something, Vic." Victor frowned and kept his voice carefully devoid of Eli's enthusiasm. "You've got 2 knowns, Eli, but no idea how many unknowns. Even if you can definitively say that an NDE and a strong will to survive are necessary components, think of how many other factors there could be. Hell, the subject might need a dozen other items on their extraordinary checklist. And the 2 components you do have they're too vague. The term genetic predisposition alone comprises hundreds of traits, any or all of which could be crucial. Does the subject need naturally elevated chemical levels or volatile glands? Does their present physical condition matter, or only their body's innate reaction to change? As for the mental state, Eli, how could you possibly calculate the psychological factors? What constitutes a strong will? It's a philosophical can of worms. And then there's the entire element of chance." "I'm not discounting any of those," said Eli, deflating a little as he guided the car into their parking lot. "This is an additive theory, not a deductive one. Can't we celebrate the fact that I've potentially made a key discovery? EOs require NDEs. I'd say that's pretty fucking cool." "But it's not enough," said Victor. "Isn't it?" snapped Eli. "It's a start. That's something. Every theory needs a place to start, Vic. The NDE hypothesis, this cocktail of mental and physical reactions to trauma, it holds water." Something small and dangerous was taking shape in Victor as Eli spoke. An idea. A way to twist Eli's discovery into his, or at least into theirs. "And this is a thesis," Eli went on. "I'm trying to find a scientific explanation for the EO phenomena. It's not like I'm actually trying to create one." Victor's mouth twitched, and then it twisted into a smile. "Why not?" "Because it's suicide," said Eli in between mouthfuls of sandwich. They were sitting in Lids, which was still fairly empty before the start of the spring semester. Only the Italian eatery, the comfort food kitchen, and the cafe were open. "Well, yes, necessarily," Victor said, sipping a coffee. "But if it worked—" "I can't believe you're actually suggesting this," said Eli, but there was something in his voice woven through the surprise. Curiosity, energy, that fervor Victor had sensed before. "Let's say you're right," pressed Victor, "and it's a simple equation, a near-death experience with an emphasis on the near, plus a certain level of physical stamina and a strong will. But you're the one who said it's not simple, that there have to be more factors." "Oh, I'm sure there are," said Victor, but he had Eli's attention. He liked having his attention. "Who knows how many factors, but I'm willing to admit that the body is capable of incredible things in life-threatening situations. That's what my thesis has been about, remember? And maybe you're right. Maybe the body is even capable of a fundamental chemical shift. Adrenaline has given people seemingly superhuman abilities in times of dire need. Glimpses of power. Perhaps there's a way to make the change a lasting one." "This is mad." "You don't believe that. Not entirely. It's your thesis, after all," said Victor. His mouth quirked as he stared down into his coffee. "Incidentally, you'd get an A on that." Eli's eyes narrowed. "My thesis wasn't meant to be theoretical." "Oh, really?" said Victor with a goading smile. "What happened to believing?" Eli frowned. He opened his mouth to answer, but was cut off by a pair of slender arms around his neck. "What has my boys looking so stern?" Victor looked up to see Angie's rust-colored curls, her freckles, her smile.
Sad the holidays are over?"
"Hardly," said Victor. "Hey, Angie," said Eli, and Victor watched the light fold in between his eyes, even as he pulled her in for one of those movie star kisses. Victor swore inwardly. He had worked so hard to bring it out, and Angie was undoing all of Eli's focus with a kiss. He pushed up from the table, annoyed.
"Where are you going?"
asked Angie. "Long day," he said. "I just got back and still have to unpack." His voice trailed off. Angie was no longer paying attention. She had her fingers tangled in Eli's hair, her lips against his. Just like that, he'd lost them both. Victor turned and left. Chapter 10. 2 days ago, the Esquire Hotel. Victor held the hotel door open while Mitch carried Sidney, wounded and soaking wet, inside. Mitch was massive, head-shaved, almost every inch of exposed skin inked, and about as broad as the girl was tall. She could have walked, but Mitch had decided that carrying her would be easier than trying to get her arm up around his shoulders. He had also carried 2 suitcases, which he dropped by the door. "This'll do, I think," he said, looking cheerfully around the luxurious suite. Victor set down another, much smaller case, peeled his wet coat off and hung it up, rolling his sleeves as he directed Mitch to put the girl in the bathroom. Sidney craned her head as she was carried through the room. The Esquire Hotel, located in downtown Merritt, was bare in a way that made her wonder if they'd thrown pieces of furniture out, and she found herself looking down to see if there were indents where chair legs or couch feet had once been. But the floor throughout was wood, or something manufactured to look like it, and the bathroom was stone and tile. Mitch set her in the shower, a large doorless marble space, and disappeared. She shivered, feeling nothing but a dull, pervasive cold, and Victor appeared several minutes later, carrying an armful of miscellaneous clothing. "One of these should fit you," he said, dropping the pile on the counter beside the sink. He stood outside the bathroom door while she pulled her own wet clothes off and examined the pile, wondering where these new clothes had come from. It looked as though they'd raided the contents of a laundry room, but the things were dry and warm, so she didn't complain.
"Sidney!"
she called at last, her voice muffled by the shirt caught halfway over her head and the door between them.
"That's my name."
"Pleasure," said Victor from the hall.
"How did you do that?"
she called out as she searched through the shirts. "Do what?" he asked.
"Make the pain stop."
It's, a gift,"
"A gift,"
mumbled Sidney bitterly. "Have you ever met someone with a gift before?" he asked through the door. Sidney let the question hang, the ensuing silence punctuated only by the sound of clothes being ruffled, tugged on, discarded. When she finally spoke again, all she said was,
"You can come in now."
Victor did, and found her in sweatpants that were too big and a spaghetti-strapped top that was too long, but both would do for now. He told her to sit very still on the counter while he examined her arm. When he cleaned away the last traces of blood, he frowned.
"What's wrong?"
she asked. "You've been shot," he said.
"Obviously."
"Were you playing with a gun or something?"
"No."
"When did this happen?" he asked, fingers pressed to her wrist.
"Yesterday."
He kept his eyes on her arm. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?"
"What do you mean?"
she asked hollowly. "Well, Sidney, you have a bullet in your arm, your pulse is several beats too slow for someone your age, and your temperature feels about 5 degrees too cold." Sidney tensed, but said nothing. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" he asked. Sidney shrugged.
"I don't know."
"I'm going to give the pain back a little," he said, "to see if you have any other injuries." She gave a small, tight nod. His grip tightened a fraction on her arm, and the dull, pervasive cold warmed to an ache, pinching into sharp pain at different points on her body. She gasped for breath, but bore with it as she told him the places where the pain was worst. She watched him as he worked, his touch impossibly light, as if he was afraid of breaking her. Everything about him was light, his skin, his hair, his eyes, his hands as they danced through the air above her skin, touching her only when absolutely necessary. "Well," said Victor, once he'd bandaged her up and taken back what was left of the pain. "Aside from the bullet wound and a twisted ankle, You seem to be in decent shape."
"Aside from that,"
said Sidney dryly. "It's all relative," said Victor. "You're alive."
"I am."
"Are you going to tell me what happened to you?" he asked.
"Are you a doctor?"
she countered. "I was supposed to be one, a long time ago."
"What happened?"
Victor sighed and leaned back toward the towel rack. "I'll trade you, an answer for an answer." She hesitated, but finally nodded. "How old are you?" he asked.
13.
She lied, because she hated being 12. "How old are you?" 32. "What happened to you?"
"Someone tried to kill me."
"I can see that. But why would someone try to do that?" She shook her head.
"It's not your turn. Why couldn't you become a doctor?"
"I went to jail," he said. "Why would someone try to kill you?" She scratched her shin with her heel, which meant she was about to lie, but Victor didn't know her well enough to know that yet.
"No idea."
Sidney almost asked about jail, but changed her mind at the last moment.
"Why did you pick me up?"
"I have a weakness for strays," he said, and then Victor surprised her by asking, "Do you have a gift, Sidney?" After a long moment, she shook her head. Victor looked down, and she saw something cross his face, like a shadow, and for the first time since the car pulled up beside her, she felt afraid. Not an all-consuming fear, but a low and steady panic spreading over her skin. But then Victor looked up and the shadow was gone. "You should get some rest, Sidney," he said. "Take the room down the hall." He turned, and was gone before she could say thank you. Victor made his way into the suite's kitchen, separated from the rest of the main room by only a marble counter, and poured a drink from the stash of liquor he and Mitch had been assembling since departing Righton, which Mitch had brought up from the car. The girl was lying, and he knew it, but he resisted the urge to resort to his usual methods. She was a kid and clearly scared, and she'd been hurt enough already. Victor let Mitch take the other bedroom. The man would never fit on the couch, and Victor didn't sleep much anyway. If he did happen to get tired, he certainly didn't mind the plush sofa. That had been his least favorite thing about prison. Not the people or the food, or even the fact that he was in prison. It was the damned cot. Victor took up his drink and wandered the wooden laminate floor of the hotel suite. It was remarkably realistic, but gave no squeak, and he could feel the concrete beneath. His legs had spent long enough standing on concrete to know. An entire wall of the living room was made of floor-to-ceiling windows, a set of balcony doors embedded in the center. He opened them and stepped out onto a shallow landing 7 stories up. The air was crisp, and he relished it as he rested his elbows on the frozen metal rail, clutching his drink, even though the ice made the glass cold enough to hurt his fingers. Not that he felt it. Victor stared out at Merritt. Even at this hour, the city was alive, a thrumming, humming place filled with people he could sense without even stretching. But at that moment, surrounded by the cold, metallic city air and the millions of living, breathing, feeling bodies, he wasn't thinking about any of them. His eyes hovered on the buildings, but his mind wandered past them all. Chapter 11. 10 years ago, Lockland University. "Well?" asked Victor later that night. He'd had a drink, a couple drinks. They kept a stocked beer shelf in the kitchen for gatherings, and a supply of hard liquor in the drawer under the bathroom sink for the very bad days, or the very good ones. "There's no way," said Eli. He saw the tumbler in Victor's hand, and headed to the bathroom to pour himself one, too. "That's not strictly true," said Victor. "There's no way to create enough control," clarified Eli as he took a long sip. "No way to ensure survival, let alone any form of abilities. Near-death experiences are still near death. It's too great a risk." "But if it worked, but if it didn't, we could create control, Eli." "Not enough. You asked me if I ever wanted to believe in something. I do. I want to believe in this. I want to believe that there's more." Vic sloshed a touch of whiskey over the edge of his glass. "That we could be more. Hell, we could be heroes." "We could be dead," said Eli. "That's a risk everyone takes by living." Eli ran his fingers through his hair. He was rattled, unsure. Victor liked seeing him that way. "It's just a theory." Nothing you ever do, Eli, is meant to be theoretical. I see it in you." Victor was very proud of verbalizing the observation in one try, considering his level of inebriation. Nevertheless, he needed to stop talking. He didn't like people to know how closely he watched, matched, mimicked them. "I see it," he finished quietly. "I think you've had enough." Victor looked down at the amber liquid. The moments that define lives aren't always obvious. They don't always scream, "ledge," and 9 times out of 10 there's no rope to duck under, no line to cross, no blood pact, no official letter on fancy paper. They aren't always protracted, heavy with meaning. Between one sip and the next, Victor made the biggest mistake of his life, and it was made of nothing more than one line, 3 small words. "I'll go first." He'd thought about it in the car on the way back from the airport, when he asked, "Why not?" He'd thought about it as they ate lunch, and then as he walked around campus finishing his coffee, thought about it all the way back to the residence halls and the upperclassmen's apartments beyond them. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th tumbler, the question mark had become a period. There wasn't a choice. Not really. This was the only way to be more than a spectator to Eli's great feats, to be a participant, a contributor. "What do you have on you?" he asked. "What do you mean?" Victor quirked a pale eyebrow, unamused. Eli didn't do drugs, but he always had them, the fast way on Lockland's campus, and Victor wagered any campus to make cash, or a few new friends. Eli seemed to see, then, where Vic was going. "No." Victor had already vanished back into the bathroom and emerged with the bottle of whiskey, which was still very full. "What do you have?" he asked again. "No." Victor sighed, crossed to the coffee table and swiped a piece of scrap paper, scribbling out a note. "See the books on the bottom shelf." "There," he said, handing it to Eli, who frowned. Vic shrugged, took another swig. "I worked hard on those books," he explained, steadying himself on the arm of the couch. "They're poetry, and they're a better suicide note than anything I'd be able to come up with right now." "No," said Eli again, but the word was distant and dull, and the light in his eyes was growing. "This isn't going to work." Even as he said it, he was walking toward his room, toward the side table where Victor knew he kept the pills. Victor pushed off the couch and followed. Half an hour later, lying on the bed with an empty bottle of Jack and an empty bottle of painkiller side by side on the nearest table, Victor began to wonder if he'd made a mistake. His heart jackhammered, forcing blood too fast through the veins. His vision swam and he closed his eyes. A mistake. He sat up suddenly, certain he'd vomit, but hands pushed him back to the bed and held him there. "No go," said Eli, easing up only when Victor swallowed and focused on the ceiling tiles. "Remember what we talked about," Eli was saying something about fighting back, about will. Victor wasn't listening, couldn't hear much over his pulse, and how could his heart pound any harder? He was no longer wondering whether or not he'd made a mistake. He was certain that in 22 years of life, this was the worst plan he had ever come up with. This was the wrong method. The fading, rational part of Victor said, the part that had been studying adrenaline and pain and fear. He shouldn't have washed the amphetamines down with whiskey, shouldn't have done anything to dull the nerves and senses, to ease the process. But he'd been nervous, afraid. Now he was going numb, and that scared him more than pain because it meant he might just fade. Fade right into death without noticing. This was wrong, wrong, wrong. But that voice was drifting off, replaced by a spreading, sinking. It could work. He forced the thought through the dulling panic. It could work. And if it did work, he wanted the chance to hold the power, the evidence, the proof. He wanted to be the proof. Without it, this was Eli's monster, and he was merely the wall off which Eli bounced his ideas. With it, he was the monster, essential, inextricable from Eli's theories. He tried counting tiles, but he couldn't keep track. Even though his heart was straining, his thoughts seeped in like syrup, new ones pouring through before the old had left. Numbers began to overlap, to blur. Everything began to blur. His fingertips felt numb in a worrying way. Not cold exactly, but as if his body were beginning to draw its energy in, to shut down, starting with the smallest parts. The nausea faded too, at least. Only the rushing pulse warned him that his body was failing.
"How are you feeling?"
asked Eli, leaning forward in a chair he'd pulled up to the bed. He hadn't had a drink, but his eyes were shining, dancing with light. He didn't look worried. He didn't seem afraid. Then again, he wasn't the one about to die. Victor's mouth felt wrong. He had to focus too hard to form the words.
"Not great,"
he managed. They'd settled for a good old-fashioned overdose for several reasons. If it failed, it would be the easiest to explain. Also, Eli could wait to call it in until they'd entered a crisis zone. Reaching the hospital too early meant it wouldn't be a near-death experience, just a very unpleasant one. The numbness was eating its way through Victor's body, up his limbs, through his head. His heart skipped, then slammed forward in a disconcerting way. Eli was talking again, low and urgent. Each time Victor blinked, it got harder to open his eyes again. And then, for a moment, fear crackled through him. Fear of dying. Fear of Eli. Fear of everything that could happen. Fear of nothing happening. It was so sudden and so strong. But soon, the numbness ate that, too. His heart skipped again, and there was a space where pain should have been, but he'd had too much to drink to feel it. He closed his eyes to focus on fighting back, but all the darkness did was eat him up. He could hear Eli speaking, and it must have been important because he was raising his voice in a way he never did, but Victor was sinking, straight through his skin and the bed and the floor, right down, into black. Chapter 12. 2 days ago, the Esquire Hotel. Victor heard something break and looked down to find he'd clutched his drink too tightly and shattered the glass. He was gripping shards, ribbons of red running down over his fingers. He opened his fist and the broken glass tumbled over the banister into the hotel restaurant shrubbery 7 stories below. He looked down at the fragments still embedded in his palm. He didn't feel them. Victor went inside and stood at the sink, picking the largest shards of glass out of his skin, watching the fragments glitter in the stainless steel basin. He felt clumsy, numb, unable to get the smaller pieces out. So he closed his eyes, took a low breath, and began to let the pain back in. Soon his hand burned, his palm painted with a dull ache that helped him determine where the lingering glass was embedded. He finished extricating the pieces and stood staring at his bloodied palm, shallow waves of pain rippling up his wrist. Extraordinary. The word that started, ruined, changed, everything. He frowned, turning up his nerves the way one would a dial. The pain sharpened, spread to a pins and needles prickle radiating out from his palm, down his fingers and up his wrist. He turned the dial up again and winced as the pins and needles became a blanket of pain across his body, not dull, but sharp as knives. Victor's hands began to shake, but he continued, twisting the dial in his mind until he was burning, breaking, shattering. His knees buckled, and he caught himself on the counter with a bloody hand. The pain switched off like a blown fuse, leaving Victor dark. He steadied himself. He was still bleeding, and he knew he should get the medical kit they'd brought up from the car for Sydney. Not for the first time, Victor wished he could trade abilities with Eli. But first, he wiped the blood from the counter and poured himself another drink. Chapter 13. 10 years ago, Lockland Medical Center. Out of nothing came pain. Not the pain Victor would later learn to know and hold and use, but the simple, too human pain of a poorly executed overdose. Pain and dark, which became pain and color, and then pain and glaring hospital lights. Eli was sitting in a chair by Victor's bed, just as he had been in the apartment. Only now there were no bottles, no pills, just beeping machines and thin sheets, and the worst headache Victor Vale had ever experienced, including the summer he decided to raid his parents' special collections while they were on a European tour. Eli's head was down, his fingers clasped loosely the way they were when he prayed. Victor wondered if that's what he was doing now, praying, and wished he would stop.
"You didn't wait long enough,"
he whispered when he was sure Eli wasn't busy with God. Eli looked up. "You stopped breathing. You almost flatlined. But I didn't." "I'm sorry," said Eli, rubbing his eyes. I couldn't." Victor sagged back into the bed. He supposed he should be thankful. Erring too early was better than erring too late. Still. He dug his fingernail under one of the sensors on his chest. If it had worked, would he feel different? Would the machines go crazy? Would the fluorescent lights shatter? Would the bed catch fire? "How do you feel?" asked Eli. "Like ass, Cardale," snapped Victor, and Eli winced more from the use of that last name than the tone. 3 drinks in, high on the wave of discovery, before the pills kicked in, they decided that when they were done, Eli would go by Ever instead of Cardale, because it sounded cooler, and in the comics, heroes had important, often alliterative names. So what if neither of them had been able to think of any examples? In that moment, it seemed to matter. For once, Victor had the natural advantage, and even though it was the smallest, most inconsequential kind of thing, the way a name fell from the tongue, he liked to have something Eli didn't. Something Eli wanted. And maybe Eli didn't really care. Maybe he was just trying to keep Victor conscious, but he still looked stung when Victor called him Cardale, and right now, that was enough. "I've been thinking," started Eli, leaning forward. There was a barely contained energy to his limbs. He twisted his hands. His legs bounced a little in his chair. Victor tried to focus on what Eli was saying with his mouth, not his body. "Next time, I think—" He stopped when a woman in the doorway cleared her throat. She wasn't a doctor, no coat, but a small name tag over her heart identified her as something worse. "Victor? My name is Melanie Pierce. I'm the resident psychologist here at Lockland Medical." Eli's back was to her, and his eyes narrowed on Victor, warning. He waved at Eli dismissively, both to tell him to get out and to confirm that he wouldn't say anything. They'd come this far. Eli rose and mumbled something about going to call Angie. He closed the door behind him. "Victor." Miss Pierce said his name in that slow, cooing way, running a hand over her mousy brown hair. It was big in that middle-aged Southern way. Her accent was unplaceable, but her tone was clearly patronizing. "The staff here told me that your emergency contacts couldn't be reached." What he thought was, "Thank God." What he said was, "My parents, right? They're on tour." "Well, in these circumstances, it's important for you to know that—" "I didn't try to kill myself." Partial lie. An indulgent twitch of her lips. "I just partied a little too hard." Total lie. A lean of her head. Her hair never moved. "Lockland's pretty high stress. I needed a break." Truth. Ms. Pierce sighed. "I believe you," she said. Lie. "But when we release you—" "When is when?" She pursed her lips. "We are obligated to keep you here for 72 hours. I have a class. You need time." "I need to go to class." "It's not up for discussion." "I wasn't trying to kill myself." Her voice had tightened into something less friendly, more honest, impatient, normal. "Then why don't you tell me what you were doing?" "Making a mistake," said Victor. "We all make mistakes," she said, and he felt ill. He didn't know if it was an after-effect of the overdose or just her pre-packaged therapy. His head fell back against the pillow. He closed his eyes, but she kept talking. "When we release you, I'm going to recommend that you meet with Lockland's counselor." Victor groaned. Counselor Pete Mark, a man with 2 first names, no sense of humor, and a sweat gland issue. "That's not really necessary," he mumbled. Between his parents, he'd had enough involuntary therapy to last several lifetimes. Miss Pierce's patronizing look returned. "I feel it is." "If I agree to it, will you release me now?" "If you don't agree to it, Lockland will not welcome you back. You'll be here for 72 hours, and during that time you'll be meeting with me." He spent the next several hours planning how to kill someone else, Miss Pierce specifically, instead of himself. Maybe, if he told her, she'd see that as progress. But he doubted it. Chapter 14. 2 days ago, the Esquire Hotel. The drink dangled precariously from Victor's freshly bandaged hand as he paced. No matter how many times he made it from one wall of the hotel room to the other and back, the restlessness refused to ebb. Instead, it seemed to charge him, a mental static crackling in his head as he moved. The urge to scream or thrash or pitch his new drink against the wall came on suddenly, and he closed his eyes and forced his legs to do the one thing they didn't want to do. Stop. Victor stood perfectly still, trying to swallow the energy and chaos and electricity, and find in its place stillness. In prison, he'd had moments like this same shade of panic peaking like a wave before crashing over him. End this, the darkness had hissed, tempted. How many days had he resisted the urge to reach out, not with his hands, but with this thing inside him, and ruin everything, everyone? But he couldn't afford to, not then, not now. The only way he'd even made it out of isolation was by convincing the staff, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he was normal, powerless, no threat, or at least no more of a threat than the other 463 inmates. But in those cell-locked moments of darkness, the urge to break everyone around him became crippling. Break them all, and just walk out. Now, just as then, he folded in, doing his best to forget he even had a power to wield against others. A whim as sharp as glass. Now, just as then, he ordered his body and mind to still, to calm. And now, just as then, when he closed his eyes and searched for silence, a word rose up to meet him, a reminder of why he couldn't afford to break. A challenge. A name. Eli. Chapter 15. 10 years ago, Lockland Medical Center. Eli slumped into the hospital chair beside Victor's bed, dropping a backpack to the laminate floor beside him. Victor himself had just finished his last session with the resident psych, Ms. Pierce, in which they had explored his relationship with his parents, of whom Ms. Pierce was, unsurprisingly, a fan. Pierce left the session with the promise of a signed book and the sense that they'd made serious progress. Victor left the session with a headache and a note to meet with Lockland's counselor a minimum of 3 times. He'd negotiated his 72-hour sentence down to 40 in exchange for that signed book. Now he was waging battle with the hospital bracelet, unable to pry it off. Eli leaned forward, produced a pocket knife, and snapped the strange paper-plastic hybrid material. Victor rubbed his wrist and stood, then winced. Nearly dying, it turned out, had not been pleasant. Everything hurt in a dull, constant way. "Ready to get out of here?" asked Eli, shouldering his backpack. "God, yes," said Victor. "What's in the bag?" Eli smiled. "I've been thinking," he said as they wound through the sterile halls, "about my turn." Victor's chest tightened. This was indeed a learning experience," said Eli. Victor muttered something unkind, but Eli continued. "Booze was a bad idea, as were painkillers. Pain and fear are inextricable from panic, and panic aids in the production of adrenaline and other fight-or-flight chemicals, as you know." Victor's brow creased. Yeah, as he knew. Not that his drunken self had cared. "There are only a certain number of situations," continued Eli as they passed through a pair of automatic glass doors and into the cold day, "where we can introduce both enough panic and enough control. The two are in most cases mutually exclusive, or at least they don't have much overlap. The more control, the less need to panic, etc., etc." "But what's in the bag?" They reached the car and Eli tossed the item in question into the back seat. "Everything we need." Eli's smile spread. "Well, everything but the ice." In fact, everything we need amounted to a dozen epinephrine pens, more commonly known as EpiPens, and twice as many one-use warming pads, the kind hunters keep in their boots and football fans in their gloves during winter games. Eli grabbed 3 of the pens and lined them up on the kitchen table beside the stack of warmers, and then stepped back, casting one sweeping motion over it, as if offering Victor a feast. Half a dozen bags of ice leaned against the sink, small rivers of cold condensation wetting the floor. They'd stopped for it on the way home. "You swipe this?" asked Victor, lifting a pen.
Borrowed in the name of science, countered Eli as he took up a hand warmer and turned it over to examine the removable plastic coating on the back that served as an activation mechanism. I've been shadowing at Lakeland Med since freshman year. They didn't even blink.
Victor's head was pounding again.
Tonight? He asked, not for the first time since Eli had explained his plan.
Tonight, confirmed Eli, plucking the pen from Victor's grip.
I considered dissolving the epinephrine directly into saline and having you administer it intravenously, since that would give a more reliable distribution, but it's slower than the EpiPens, and dependent on better circulation. Besides, given the nature of the setup, I thought we'd be better off with a more user-friendly option. Victor considered the supplies. The EpiPen would be the easy part, the compressions more difficult and more damaging. Victor had CPR training and an intuitive understanding of the body, but it was still a risk. Neither pre-med clusters nor innate skill could truly prepare a student for what they were trying to do. Killing something was easy. Bringing it back to life took more than measurement and medicine. It was like cooking, not baking. Baking took a sense of order. Cooking took flair, a little art, a little luck. This kind of cooking took a lot of luck. Eli took up 2 more EpiPens and arranged the 3 in his palm. Victor's gaze wandered from the pens to the warmers to the ice. Such simple tools,